The Western Monster Hunter community is a magical place, where almost any question you've ever had about the series has probably already been asked at some point or another. Though most of these questions tend to focus more on gameplay-related concerns, one will inevitably stumble across broader, more thought-provoking questions, such as, why isn't Guildmarm real and also my wife? How do they get the milk for Kirin butter? Should Capcom finally nerf Longsword? And of course, do Wyverians really lay eggs? These are all interesting topics in their own right, but there's one particular question that's endured among even the most burning topics in the community's recent years. Is Monster Hunter getting easier? More often than not, this question tends to elicit one of two different responses.
Of course the series is getting too easy. There's way too many new mechanics that undermine and devalue the core gameplay.
Getting too easy? No. You've just played so much Monster Hunter that you've naturally grown more skilled as a hunter. That's why the hardest entry is always your first.
These stances are entirely contrary to each other, displaying two very different attitudes towards Monster Hunter as a whole. And the thing is, it's not really a new point of discussion for Western fans. I've personally seen the topic brought up twice over after both Tri and Generations first released years ago. But it's a topic that's grown more turbulent with the release of Monster Hunter World in 2018. Not just because World introduced so many drastic changes to the series' core gameplay formula, but also because it catapulted Monster Hunter from Capcom's most popular series in Japan into their most popular series, period. With the Monster Hunter fanbase ballooning in size practically overnight, there's more people than ever chiming into the debate, with the old guard seemingly at odds with the new blood. The answer to the query of Monster Hunter's waning difficulty is one that's typically broken down into these two all-encompassing absolutes. Either the series is undermining its long-standing difficulty with new features, or its players have simply grown too adept at hunting monsters. Only one of these answers can be correct. Unless both sides of this argument hold such an equal amount of weight that somewhere in between these two extremes, there exists another answer. Monster Hunter's difficulty is built upon dozens of gameplay factors that have been refined and readjusted over the series' 18-year history, be it the minor quality of life tweaks or the more all-encompassing gameplay changes. It's a topic that, quite frankly, isn't often treated with the care and nuance that it really deserves. Through this video, I hope to show that Monster Hunter's difficulty is the product of innumerable factors inside and around the games, dispelling the notion that this debate has only a single, solitary answer, as well as showcase part of the reason why this series has grown to be one of Capcom's most profitable and well-recognized IPs of all time. Before we can get that far, though, we have to answer one simple question. What makes Monster Hunter difficult to begin with? Ryozo Sugimoto, the current series producer, has stated clearly in past interviews that your technique as a hunter is the ultimate deciding factor because Monster Hunter is an action game. Not an action RPG, but a pure action game. While the series does rely on a series of complex damage formulas and damage modifiers to determine every point of damage dealt, a deeper understanding of this system is ultimately secondary to your skill as a player. Monster Hunter's progression system is a relatively unique one in that your hunter's base abilities are completely static across the entire game. Even in games like Generations and Rise, which feature super attacks or new maneuvers you can unlock, your basic movement options never change. Any sort of improvement or modification to your base movement is typically a temporary measure you have to earn and equip, rather than a permanent, long-standing upgrade. The only difference between an evasive maneuver done within the first hour and the 100th hour is the player behind it. While the hunter's base abilities remain static, the series' monsters only get more powerful across higher ranks. As players gradually hone their skills and gain access to better gear, improving the monster's own base abilities is the series' main method of keeping its players, and therefore its difficulty curve, in check. The foundation of Monster Hunter's core gameplay, and upon which the difficulty has been historically designed around, is the player's own situational awareness and how well they understand the monsters and all options available at their disposal. In stark contrast to most other action games, raw execution isn't the sole deciding factor to success in Monster Hunter. Recognizing the challenge ahead and committing to a strategy that can overcome it are just as important, if not more so. Every other aspect of the series' gameplay is derived from these main axioms, be it the series' first installment or its most recent. This sentiment is even reflected and reinforced through various interviews with series developers throughout the years. As Ryozo Tsujimoto himself once said, "The most important element in Monster Hunter is the action strategy between monster and player. Considering the way the monster is currently moving and deciding how to react is paramount. Always being aware of your location and the context of the battle is key." This rigid, deliberate design philosophy has resulted in an extremely unique difficulty curve, one largely dependent upon the player and their choices. At this point, I feel it's worth stressing that difficulty in video games is already a highly subjective topic by itself. What's most relevant to this video isn't whether or not there's a correct way in which Monster Hunter should challenge players, but instead determining just what contributes to that challenge. Generally speaking, your average video game will be designed around the idea of a gradual difficulty curve, steadily increasing as players either hone their skills or gain new in-game abilities. Give players too many options though, and it'll only get tougher to account for and balance around every potential gameplay scenario. This also holds true for Monster Hunter to a certain extent, and is part of why I feel it's hard for there to be a true consensus on the series' difficulty. Historically, Monster Hunter has always given players a bevy of gameplay options, affording them the freedom of choosing their own approach to monster hunting. Though this is more applicable to some entries than others, it's been true of the series ever since the beginning. Even in the very first Monster Hunter, there were already 7 different weapons to choose from, each with their own advantages and drawbacks. Every weapon's unique skill set gave each one different game plans to work towards, and thus different lenses to view the series' combat through. Proper positioning, timing, and knowledge of the monster's movesets were always paramount to success, but every weapon emphasized these attributes in different ways. In practice, each monster has to be balanced around all of the different gameplay options at the player's disposal. This includes not only each of the different weapon types available to players, but also any new or recurring mechanics introduced in subsequent generations. But most importantly, monsters have to be designed to account for newcomers unfamiliar with the series, introducing new mechanics and the behavioral quirks of different monster types. This can easily be seen in-game with the inclusion of monsters meant to introduce or expand upon existing gameplay concepts, but it's also been outright confirmed by the series' own development team in past interviews. With all this taken into account, we've established that Monster Hunter's difficulty, across the entire series, is contingent upon variables tied to the player's skill level, weapon choice, and even the monster in question. Even before factoring in a single gameplay change between installments, it's already clear that the series' difficulty is, by design, something that'll vary wildly from person to person. Monster Hunter is a series all about choices, with every choice being a different factor that directly influences the game's difficulty in some form or another. With the difficulty being heavily contingent upon a player's situational awareness, skill level, and ability to commit to every decision surrounding a hunt, not every player will face the same exact struggles as a hunter. Even in a hypothetical scenario in which 2 players bring the exact same weapons, armor sets, and items into a hunt, their own unique inclinations, habits, and skills could still vary tremendously, and thus lead to some degree of playstyle deviation during gameplay. That's the consequence of Monster Hunter's difficulty heavily playing off the human element. Not everybody is wired the same way. It's tricky to gauge just how hard Monster Hunter really is when a large part of the difficulty is derived from how players understand and approach the monsters themselves. Between players either counterpicking monsters by switching weapon types, dedicated weapon mains remaining loyal to their favorite weapon, or even those who switch playstyles just for fun, not everybody is going to share in the exact same hunting experience, because they're approaching the game in their own unique ways. Even the series' current producer has acknowledged this individualistic aspect of Monster Hunter's gameplay, ultimately recognizing and embracing it through the introduction of hunting styles and generations. With a series that derives challenge partially by leaning so heavily into player expression and the human element, it's inevitable that there would also be some monsters that players will just struggle with for entirely personal reasons. Maybe you're like me and just have consistently bad luck approaching Rathalos, or you're more like my brother who struggles with Zinogre's Paw Slam attack. Despite these being monsters we've hunted dozens of times over, and monsters you might not even have any issues with yourself. Player-based issues like these are why items, armor skills, and weapon matchups are so important. Every player can use these different options to make up for their own innate shortcomings, level the playing field, and eventually develop their own strategy to counter specific monsters. This isn't to imply there aren't other games where the difficulty is proportionate to the player's skill level. However, the skill that Monster Hunter asks of the player is less about sheer physical dexterity and more about developing the appropriate mindset to tackle the game with. The structure of the series' core gameplay loop, down to the inclusion of break rewards and 1% drops sometimes necessitating hunting monsters repeatedly, is all a deliberate means to further reinforce the growth of players' awareness, adaptability, and composure. Players who commit long enough to fully understand the unspoken rules of Monster Hunter's gameplay will eventually reach a point where the main mechanics of the game are seared into their muscle memory, and as such will understand how to work and prepare against nearly everything the game could throw at them. This all lends further credence to the argument that the series only feels like it's getting easier because you're improving as a player. It's the entire basis of Monster Hunter's difficulty. Generally speaking, the series is at its absolute hardest when you're a fledgling hunter, whose grasp and understanding of the gameplay are at their absolute lowest possible points. There's a reason why, for many players, the all-around hardest Monster Hunter they'll ever play will be their first. Every entry is iterative upon the last. Even World and Rise, both of which feature swaths of all-encompassing gameplay changes, are still built upon the same foundation as older entries. Once you have a firm understanding of the series' core gameplay, none of the later games will be as immediately challenging to hunters who spent hundreds of hours already fighting some of the series' toughest monsters across endgame hunts. Starting up a new Monster Hunter game may involve starting with all your resources and equipment back to zero, but the knowledge and skills you've honed in one installment will seamlessly carry over into the next. You never have to spend time struggling to figure out which items and armor skills to prioritize, getting a handle on the gameplay basics, or figuring out which weapon clicks best with you. As a seasoned hunter, you now have a set of expectations of what's to come and what goals to work towards. Even if these plans can deviate slightly from one entry into the next, it's a blueprint you can generally always fall back on. So far, that sounds pretty much like a shut and locked argument, doesn't it? If the series' perceived difficulty is mainly owed to player experience and each hunter's individual characteristics, wouldn't that mean every Monster Hunter is designed and balanced to be equally difficult?
Wrong!
Monster Hunter's difficulty is generally derived from the player's ability to understand and make the most of the choices presented to them, whether those choices involve preparing for a hunt or their actions during a quest. Every mechanic is so tightly integrated together that there are dozens of different gameplay elements that could contribute to the overall difficulty, no matter how minute they may seem. While it is very much possible to isolate and break down every last one of these different elements, it'd be about as engaging as reading through a list of publicly accessible patch notes. I think the less menial approach here will be to focus on just one specific design philosophy, which I feel is the linchpin resulting in these claims of the series growing too easy as of its 5th generation. I'm of course referring to the series' longtime focus on commitment and its emphasis on risk versus reward based gameplay. Every aspect of the series' gameplay is designed around the idea that you, as the player, are completely committed to your every action from the moment you set out on a hunt. This overarching philosophy could be felt practically everywhere in older entries, especially in the core gameplay. There's a very distinct weight and rigidity in how hunters controlled, a certain nuance to the core gameplay that even the most shameless of Monster Hunter's imitators don't seem to pick up on. Whether your hunter was attacking, evading, or even merely using items, every one of your moves had clearly defined windows in which you couldn't take any other action until your current one was finished. Considering that your hunter never moved very gracefully to begin with, challenge was derived less from what you did during hunts, but understanding when to act in the first place. This led to every player's action becoming extremely weighted, thereby leading to higher stakes and a heightened sense of tension during hunts. Those who didn't understand when and when not to take their action be it as simple as healing or hefting a chunk of steel into a monster's face, simply wouldn't make it very far as hunters. The concept of a free action, a move which could be performed at any time with zero consequences, simply didn't exist in Monster Hunter. Being held accountable for your every move meant that hunts were actively balanced out by a countless series of risks versus rewards playing out in real time. Kaname Fujioka has even touched on how this aspect of the gameplay is not only intentional, but is deeply rooted in the series' design. One stating that, if we're going to change Monster Hunter so that it basically features one giant contiguous area, then we have to really reformulate and rethink everything so it works correctly. And true to his word, when the series finally abandoned segmented maps in favor of larger interconnected hunting grounds, a staggering amount of gameplay changes immediately followed. Starting with Monster Hunter World, your hunter is no longer forced to commit to the vast majority of their actions. Where items once had to be used thoughtfully and gingerly, any misjudged item use can now simply be rolled out of to cancel the animation with no repercussions. The importance of timing and positional awareness are further de-emphasized by the fact that most items can be used on the move now, making it possible to merely outrun attacks without wasting an item. Items were just one part of how older entries stressed the importance of preparation, pushing players to plan around entering quests with only the items at their side and the gear on their back. This philosophy was then discarded after World's introduction of base camps, letting players restock items and change equipment at their own leisure mid-hunt. Not only is there now zero danger of ever running low on items or ammunition, but the unique challenge offered by multi-monster quests is trivialized now that you're not limited to a single armor set for the duration of the quest. Many of these gameplay changes introduced by World have since been labeled as quality of life changes by many, when they really aren't. These are examples of significant gameplay changes that directly affect the player's gameplay options, and thus how they approach the game on a fundamental level. Real quality of life changes would be more linear improvements that don't exert notable influence over the core gameplay. The bulk of 5th Gen's changes have led to a new age of Monster Hunter in which players have far more safety nets and wiggle room to improvise during hunts as they see fit. The driving philosophy that every choice is final and must be committed to, and thus the difficulty born from it, has been drastically de-emphasized, with your hunter's gameplay options being wildly more flexible and versatile than ever before. Though World and Rise diverge in how that flexibility is integrated into their respective mechanics. World actively encouraged the suppression of a monster's options through features like the slinger, mantles, and increased map interactivity, while Rise instead focused more on further deepening player expression through its all-encompassing wire bug system. Any new and returning monster now has to be designed and redesigned around each of these new mechanics, with varying degrees of success. Since the very beginning, Monster Hunter's core combat design has centered around reading and reacting to monster behavior, adjusting your offense accordingly. Every monster has their deliberate tells and pauses that give keen-eyed players those coveted windows of opportunity. This dynamic between players and monsters is yet another one of the biggest driving forces behind the series' difficulty, and is an incredibly delicate balance to maintain. At least, that was the idea back when commitment was integral to the series' overall design. Monster Hunter has steadily been growing more complex over time, but as of 5th Gen, this complexity has reached the point where monsters now have to account for 14 different weapon types, denser map design with more varied terrain, players who can easily and freely outmaneuver monsters at any moment, and even have ample opportunities to weaponize the map itself against monsters. With monsters still having to introduce new players to the basic rules of the series' gameplay, and those same players now having more options than ever before, that delicate balance has steadily grown more skewered towards the player's favor in recent years. Both World and Rise, being the products of different development teams, worked in their own countermeasures to balance around these new gameplay options, but the end result in either game makes for more of a kinetic hunting experience, rather than the methodical, slower-paced hunts of older games. That elegant simplicity of old world hunting has been cast aside in favor of looser, more reaction-based hunts, with far less restrictions imposed upon the player. None of this is to say there aren't dozens of other changes between World and Rise that streamline the gameplay, but I do feel it's the reduced emphasis on player commitment that most contributes to the relative leniency of these games, primarily because it's the impetus for these changes to begin with. Any changes that have come as a result of this paradigm shift have ultimately increased the player's margin for error, and as such, make for generally easier, more approachable games on a fundamental level. None of this is meant to suggest that World and Rise's gameplay changes are inherently good or bad on their own merits. Monster Hunter's gameplay is just so tightly designed that any change will have an adverse effect on the experience in some way, and 5th Gen brought several such changes to the table. It's really not surprising that most discussion of the series' difficulty tends to focus on these two games exclusively. It's not even the first time in the series that new mechanics have been scrutinized to such an extent. While many of 5th Gen's mechanical changes tend to be blamed for making the series too easy, there was a time the same was said about Monster Hunter Tri's introduction of the fatigue system and mounting back in Monster Hunter 4. After all, both mechanics were ultimately a means to give players more openings to exploit and turn against the monster, something seen as unthinkable during the Freedom Unite era. It's important to consider that more dynamic gameplay features like these have steadily and undoubtedly given hunters more leeway over the years, but I think part of why mechanics like these tend to be given a bit more slack is because they were carefully integrated into the series back when unbroken commitment was the linchpin of its design. Every new mechanic or feature introduced was implemented in Counterbalance in such a way that they rarely undercut or trivialize the series' core gameplay, instead adding even more depth into the series' existing gameplay systems. Tri's fatigue system was counterbalanced by the existing rage mode system, mounting generally didn't afford more than 1 or 2 extra openings per hunt, and decoration slots opened up more possibilities for armor set mixing without severely undercutting the skill point system. That isn't to say every change in the old world era of Monster Hunter was handled flawlessly though. While ideas like vertical map design and mounting took some refinements to be properly realized, there's really no change more consistent and egregious than Capcom's infamous rebalancing of the weapons themselves. In a series bursting with so many gameplay variables, even the slightest change to a weapon's property can make all the difference between a weapon falling anywhere between ineffective to overtuned. These changes can be as simple as Longsword's abundance of low-cost counters in base Rise, as complex as the bowgun customizability experimented with exclusively in Tri, or as unique as the new mechanics added to Charge Blade between the releases of Vanilla 4 and 4U. Given that your weapon choice already plays an enormous part in how difficult the game might be for you, how Capcom then chose to rebalance that weapon in a given entry is another wild card on top of that. These balancing quirks also extend to game-specific mechanics like switch skills, hunter arts, and styles, but seeing that I've already dedicated an entire video to those mechanics, I'm not really going to get more into them here. Trust me, that's not because I'm desperately fishing for engagement on my floundering YouTube channel. There are still plenty of other mechanics or aspects of the series that could potentially influence its difficulty, such as the improved readability of monsters, a game's quest progression and pacing, or even the inclusion of delayed wake-ups. The main reason I'm not going more in depth on these aspects, besides not wanting to bloat this video into the length of a movie, is because I think it's been made clear at this point that Monster Hunter's difficulty isn't strictly determined by any one specific feature. However, there does exist one other unique feature of the series that I don't think is often considered when this discussion crops up.
What the fuck, is that a fucking cat? Ma! Yo, there's a stray cat outside!
Starting with Monster Hunter Freedom 2, players had the ability to weaponize and arm felines of their very own and venture off into hunts together, establishing an extremely understated but significant element to the series' difficulty. These palicos didn't have access to the same weapons or items that hunters did, so the value in hunting alongside a palico wasn't in their negligible damage output, but that their very presence could draw a monster's attention away from the hunter, alleviating some of the pressure on the hunter by creating more openings for them to act as necessary. Even as this buddy system was further developed across subsequent installments, the series has taken care to ensure that your hunting buddies remain supplementary to your abilities as a hunter, significant enough to make a difference in a hunt, but not enough to completely displace your own actions and agency as a hunter. Well, for the most part. Fortunately, if you ever feel like hunting buddies are undermining your skill as a player, there's always plenty of room left over on the bench. In essence, buddies are one of the closest things Monster Hunter has to a difficulty modifier. Veterans can choose to challenge monsters by truly hunting alone, while newcomers can bring buddies along to create extra openings during hunts. In this sense, the buddy system is effectively Monster Hunter's equivalent of putting the training wheels onto a bike, but not necessarily in the way that you might think. Yes, the inclusion of hunting buddies is undoubtedly a means of letting players hunt solo without having to bear the full brunt of truly flying solo. But hunting buddies do more than teach players how to hunt alone. They're meant to acclimate players to the idea of hunting together. Multiplayer is more than just another meager factor in Monster Hunter's overall difficulty. It's the most important gameplay element in the series. It's no exaggeration to say that the ability to hunt with others is the backbone on which the entire series is built. Multiplayer is entrenched so deeply in Monster Hunter's design that it remains an undeniable part of why the series has even thrived to this very day. Mechanically, hunting with friends affects the difficulty much in the same way that hunting with buddies does. The presence of others will naturally draw monster attention away from you, offloading some of the innate tension that hunting brings. The key difference between them is that while hunting buddies aren't strong enough to consistently deal significant damage to monsters, other hunters are. Staying true to the series' original emphasis on risk versus reward, the presence of other hunters is then counterbalanced by the long-standing 3 feint system. Because any one player carding in a hunt counts towards this 3 feint limit, the potential for success and failure naturally increases in relation to the number of players in a hunt. This system further amplifies every mistake made by every player, with even a single card subsequently ramping up the stakes for everybody else. Keeping in mind that not everyone will approach the game in exactly the same way, throwing more players into a group together introduces even more variables that'll impact the difficulty, depending upon the group's size, synergy, and skill level. A reliable team of 4 hunters who can coordinate and carry themselves together will, on average, struggle far less compared to a hodgepodge team of uncoordinated randoms online. In either case, it's still possible to be the best player in a group and still have your hard work undermined by a series of misplaced cards. On the other hand, the inverse is equally true. Considering that the average quest across the series roughly scales multiplayer monster health to balance around a team of just 2 players, even a decently coordinated team of 4 hunters has the potential to completely trivialize even some of the hardest fights around. It's really telling that even as World and Rise modernized the multiplayer with real-time scaling of monster HP, the internal balancing mechanism which drove the multiplayer was otherwise left completely intact. The number of variables that affects Monster Hunter's difficulty effectively multiplies when factoring in the presence of other hunters. Every single variable applicable to yourself is just as true of your fellow hunters, in addition to how well each hunter can strategize and cooperate as a team. Given just how many variables already exist when playing alone, the variables unique to multiplayer make it tricky to tell if the overall difficulty is truly fluctuating or not. Here's the thing though. While multiplayer itself is the greatest variable in the series' difficulty, this variability is what Monster Hunter is truly designed and balanced around.
What?
Ultimately, Monster Hunter is a series filled with several balances and counterbalances working together to create an incredibly deep risk versus reward system, designed around the idea that you'll eventually work together with other hunters. Everything about the series, up to and including the ability to trip your own teammates during hunts, feeds into this idea of hunting and working together as a group. It's really not coincidental that hunting with others has the potential to both trivialize and exacerbate a large part of Monster Hunter's difficulty. Everything discussed in prior sections was originally conceived around the idea of hunting together with other people and fostering an environment where everybody's actions were equally relevant to their success or failure. Every core mechanic was originally designed to work in tandem to ensure that every hunter's contributions to the hunt are meaningful. Just as you share in each other's failure, your triumphs are your fellow hunters' triumphs. It's even possible that Capcom's focus on keeping group hunts evenly balanced is what ended up defining the direction of the series' gameplay, and not the other way around. Rather than being a more execution-heavy game like its Capcom contemporaries, Monster Hunter's gameplay has always emphasized a more methodical, knowledge-driven approach. In a more heavily co-op based game, the physical dexterity required to keep up in a faster-paced environment can't really be imparted onto other players, but the knowledge required to circumvent and counter the game's challenges can be. Though the series developers have never outright said as much themselves, certain developer interviews have suggested or alluded to this being one of the many conscious developmental decisions involved with the series. As the Ozo Tsujimoto himself once said, "It's very fair to people of all skill levels. Even if you're a newbie, you can play along with expert players and they can support you in playing along with them, and you don't feel like you're just useless or left behind. They can help you get involved in the game and then help you brush up your skills. It's that kind of communal play aspect that I think has been key to the series' popularity in Japan. Which brings us back to the original question posed at the start of this video. Is Monster Hunter truly getting easier, or are its players merely improving as hunters? As evidenced by all the different iterations of Monster Hunter we've touched on, the true answer should be as clear as it'll ever be by this point. However, when all is said and done, I feel that this question is ultimately an irrelevant one. Yes, Monster Hunter has unquestionably been getting easier. Monster Hunter World alone has fundamentally changed aspects of the series' core gameplay that make these newer games more approachable and forgiving than ever before. The series is now confronted with the task of experimenting with new, different ways of challenging players, as evidenced by nearly all of Iceborne's extremely experimental post-game monsters. The original ideology behind the series' difficulty simply can't be applied to the newer gameplay format as is. As a matter of fact, it's not hard to see Capcom figuring out this rebalancing process in real time. You ever noticed how many of World and Iceborne's late game monsters experimented with DPS checks or one-shot attacks, possibly balanced around the increasing prevalence of the mantle system and health boost? Now contrast that with Rise and Sunbreak's own late game monsters, which instead sport an abundance of follow-up and AoE attacks meant to suppress and counter your expanded movement options. These growing pains are a byproduct of a power creep that the series really never had to worry about before these specific games. But even prior to these entries, Monster Hunter was already growing more lax, evidenced by the many mechanical improvements made from the series' debut up to its 4th generation. Granted, it may not have been at the expense of the series' core gameplay design at the time, but these improvements nonetheless played a part in offsetting or streamlining aspects of the gameplay. Even Monster Hunter Tri, when it first released over a decade ago, was criticized in some circles for being too easy compared to Freedom Unite, thanks in part to tighter hitboxes, the new fatigue system, and the omission of G-Rank. In spite of the game also introducing more advanced, nuanced monster behavior, which would become the new standard for the series going forward. Regardless of which game we're focusing on, the hardest part of the series is when you're still discovering and learning all of the nuances involved with hunting. Nothing is ever really going to match the tension of encountering a T-Rex or doing an egg quest for the very first time, but that's no fault of the series itself. Monster Hunter has to spend time bringing newer players into the fold, just as much as it brings in something new for veterans to chew on. That's part of why endgame content like rare subspecies, advanced event quests, level 140 guild quests, and anomaly investigations even exist. Veterans can still push their limits with more difficult quests without completely alienating newcomers or more casual players. And I am aware I still haven't touched on several other elements that could impact the series' difficulty, like the improved accessibility of in-game information, hybridization of Blademaster and Gunner armors, streamlined item crafting, the skill point revamp, wirefalling, prowlers, spirit birds, weapon counters, or even the inclusion of gameplay patches. But look, this video has to end eventually, right? It's a testament to the sheer depth of this series that there's so many relevant mechanics worth talking about. I think I've exhaustively covered most of the essential ones as is. And even besides that, is there really any meaning in covering everything else at this point? If difficulty was truly this integral to Monster Hunter's identity, then how is it that the Japanese exclusive Portable Third, unquestionably one of the easiest games of the entire franchise, was its best-selling installment up until World's release? It's because difficulty has never been the most defining part of the series. Monster Hunter was originally founded upon the idea of creating a successful multiplayer game, and that's one of the reasons Monster Hunter skyrocketed in popularity to begin with. I don't think what matters in this argument is how hard Monster Hunter should be. What matters are the ways in which it does challenge players, and that the options used to overcome said challenges are properly balanced against the game's existing systems. I think part of this misconception that punishing difficulty always mattered in Monster Hunter is because the series has historically relied on using challenge and adversity as teaching tools. You just won't get past the skill floor until the appropriate lessons are learned. Though these lessons can never be unlearned, they can be passed on to newcomers or those still struggling on their own hunts. And in time, those newcomers may become veterans of their own. who might even pass the same lessons to another hunter. That's how Monster Hunter has largely worked since its inception, in spite of every entry's idiosyncrasies and misgivings. While difficulty is still relevant to Monster Hunter, the games have always been built upon countless different features and quirks synergizing together to create an incredibly unique, one-of-a-kind series. Difficulty is only one part of that formula for success, not the key to the whole equation. There's absolutely nothing wrong with hunting solo, playing with friends, chasing after the thrill of a good challenge, or even preferring one style of Monster Hunter over the other. But this series was never about difficulty solely for its own sake. Regardless of where exactly the series goes next, Monster Hunter is and will always be at its most difficult when the games force you to learn and adapt to new circumstances. Whether you're a newcomer experiencing the series for the first time or a veteran experimenting with new gameplay options, that's only a small part in what makes the series so engaging to begin with. And in my eyes, that's what makes the series Monster Hunter.